Okay, we are recording, and now I am going to pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Hannah Abrahamson, sorry, from the history department. Hannah, take it away.
Hello, everybody. This event stems from some of the questions that I've had from my students who are interested in law, think that they may want to be lawyers, know for sure that they want to be lawyers, and some of the information that they are hoping to know. So at this time, I'm going to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. If each of you could tell us perhaps your class year, your major, a bit about your career journey, maybe a few sentences about what you're doing now, just a brief intro to who you are before we get into the questions.
Youngest to oldest. You go first, Adonis.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Adonis Pitts. I graduated from Holy Cross in 2016. So I'm a relatively recent grad. I feel like, I don't know if I can still classify, but I feel like I'm a recent grad still. At Holy Cross, I majored in political science and concentrated in Africana studies. There were a number of things that I did at Holy Cross that I think influenced my decision to go to law school. So during my rising junior and rising senior summers, I spent my time at the United States District Courthouse as a coordinator for the Judge Lindsay Fellowship Programs, which is a fellowship that I encourage you all to apply for. Essentially, it takes students who are historically underrepresented in the legal field and allows them to shadow a judge for one part of the program. And then the second part of the program, you're either in the United States, the United States, what is it called? The I don't know, the AG's office, I think, I'm not sure. Then the probation office, or I forget what the third, or the federal defender's office. I was the coordinator for the program, so I don't really remember like where students were placed, but they're typically placed in one of those locations for the second half of the summer. I also was part of the Washington, D.C. semester program, which, if you don't already know what that entails, essentially you write a thesis, you participate in a public policy seminar program, and then you do an internship. So I was a legislative assistant at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is also known as the NAACP. And I kind of entered Holy Cross knowing that I wanted to go to law school. It was kind of why I chose Holy Cross. And so once I graduated, I planned on taking the summer to sort of take the LSAT and then teach. But because of COVID and the way things worked out, I ended up taking the November LSAT. So what I did was I worked at Oracle, which is like a tech company, as a business development consultant until the end of that year. And then I started training and everything to be a teacher at Brooke Charter School. And so I taught for the year before going to law school. And now I'm a 1L at Boston College Law School, where I'm involved in BALSA, which is our Black Law Student Association, and Lambda, which is like another affinity group for queer students. And then I'm also in Business Law Society. This summer in the Business Law Society, I will be at Dane Torpy, which is like a small real estate firm. But yeah, and I can speak to some other opportunities that exist for 1Ls and sort of what the, I guess, job process, hiring process kind of looks like for 1Ls, because it is a bit different than like what it will look like for 2Ls.
Can you briefly explain what a 1L and 2L are,
yes.
just in case not everyone is aware?
Yeah, so law school is 3 years. And so your first year, you're considered a 1L, your second year, 2L, third year, a 3L. And so typically during your summers, you'll be doing something, right? During your 1L summer, though, there are not always a lot of job options for 1Ls. So it's okay if you're doing whatever you were doing before law school during that 1L summer. But there are some opportunities to do, I feel like typically students do more public sector focused stuff, or whatever you were doing before you came to law school. There are some internships. And then for, again, students who are historically underrepresented in the legal field. They have diversity fellowships at big law firms. I feel like someone else can probably speak more to what a big law firm is, and just sort of how law firms are tiered in that way, I guess. But yeah, so there is that opportunity for those students. Yeah. Is there anything else I should add for now, I guess?
No, that's great. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
I'm not sure who's next oldest according to Lauren's criteria there. So I'll let the three of you hash that out as to who goes next.
Lauren was the co-president when I was like a sophomore, so I assume that means that I'm younger. Hi everyone, my name is Nima Hakim. I graduated from Holy Cross in 2014. I, like Adonis, did the DC semester program, interned at the White House Office of Communications for then President Obama, and actually was fortunate enough to go back after graduating from Holy Cross in 2014. So I worked at the White House for about 2 years in the Office of Communications, moved over to the Department of Homeland Security for about 1 year, the last year of the Obama administration, and then worked at a private public relations firm, a private sector public relations firm for about 1 year while I was preparing applications for law school. In terms of the decision to go to law school, it was just working in government alongside a lot of attorneys and getting a very specific sense of the work that they did, and how essential it was to driving policy and other issues forward. And for law school, I actually went to BC for my first year. I transferred to U Chicago Law, and then graduated in 2021, and then came back to Massachusetts and clerked at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court for an associate justice, and then started at a big law firm, which basically just means a law firm with more than 500 attorneys. I think that's the line, but maybe it's higher, I don't know. And Ropes and Gray is a firm that's headquartered here in Boston, but it's a global law firm, has about 1,400 attorneys, 14 global offices. So I work as a litigator. So what a litigator does is basically what you might think of when you think of law, in the sense that when a lawsuit gets filed, my job and our team's job is to represent our clients in court, and also before court, and in between, like pretrial stages and other stages that are part of the judicial process. So that's my path, and then we'll obviously get into the questions a bit more, I expect.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be with all of you tonight. My name is Lauren Maloney. I graduated from Holy Cross in 2012, so just over 10 years ago. I just had my 10-year reunion last spring, which was nice and really awesome to be back on campus and see friends. I'm also married to a Holy Cross alum, same class year, which is really fun. We have 2 little Holy Cross babies, which is great. So they're upstairs shrieking. So if you hear shrieking, that's what that is. But love Holy Cross, and it's really fun, obviously, to be back here. My story is a little bit different in terms of my career in the legal industry. So I am not a lawyer. I did not go to law school. I thought about law school for like maybe a hot second, which is kind of funny that I ended up in the legal industry, because I think I had considered law school for a minute, thought about applying to the DC program, which obviously Nima and Adonis both did, but just ultimately decided that law school was not something that I thought I wanted to do. I did end up going to graduate school. I have a master's degree in education, spent a couple of years working in higher ed, in roles actually kind of similar to what Ben does at Holy Cross, and then kind of did a career change and decided that I wanted more of a corporate role, and pivoted over to work in recruiting. So I was a campus recruiter at Deloitte for several years, so more in the business industry. I was recruiting students initially for functions like audit and tax, and then ultimately consulting. So I did that for a while, and then got a message on LinkedIn about a job at a law firm called Mintz, which I really didn't know much about law firms, but I got a message about this job, and it felt like a really good fit. And I think, again, the whole legal industry was something that was interesting to me. Again, like something that I think in the back of my mind, I maybe thought about doing, like a path untraveled. So I ended up interviewing and got the job at Mintz. So I've been with Mintz now since February of 2020. So just about 3 years. And I work in our recruiting department. I oversee all associate recruiting. So we can kind of talk about what that means to an extent, but basically people graduate from law school, start working at a law firm, and they're called something called an associate. And you're basically an associate really until you go up for partner. There are some senior levels of attorneys called counsels, like special counsels and of counsels. But most people you're considered an associate, like basically really until you go up for partner at a lot of, at most big law firms. So in my role, I oversee all associate recruiting. That's for all of Mintz's offices and all of our sections at the firm. It's a really fun job. I love it. I love working with law students, but also folks that are, experienced professionals that are thinking about making career changes. And Mintz, as Nima described, is what people consider sort of like a big law, working in big law or big law firm, which basically just means you have a lot of lawyers and you make a lot of money. Like, to be totally crass about it, like that's like basically what big law is. And so Mintz is smaller than Ropes and Gray. We're between like 500 and 600 attorneys, so a little bit smaller, but still considered sort of in that big law category. So I think that's probably a good place to pause. And yes, I think Hannah's synopsis in the comments there is right. Hence, it looks like Nima's still in the office over there. So
Yes. So thank you so much for those intros. It also helps give us a sense of where the questions are going, and in it'll help overlap with some of these questions. I'm going to do that annoying thing that professors do and combine the two first questions because they're really interrelated. So first, what is the value of a law degree, but within the context of student loans, high student loans? So would you recommend taking out loans for law school? Are there other ways to finance a degree? What is the value in both in terms of jobs, but also in terms of the compensation that's there?
I'm happy to weigh in on this. So in terms of the value of the law degree, I think it's good to point out that the economic value of it is obviously really important. What I would say is I'm not fully aware of a lot of other ways other than student loans to finance your legal education. There are some. I mean, so some schools have scholarships, right? So when you apply and you look at a law school's application page, they may have certain scholarships. For example, if you're interested in a particular field. A lot of schools, if not most schools, have a public service scholarship. And so if you don't necessarily want to pursue a legal career in the private sector immediately after you graduate, which will generally pay more and will allow you to pay down your debt at a quicker rate, you can look at those scholarships. The warning there is they're not many, so they're hard to get and they're highly competitive. So it can be difficult, but you can take on student loans, and this might be one thing that is a bit of a relief. Is that yes, it's a lot of costs a lot to go to law school. That's just a fact. But if you are willing to work hard and you're very serious academically, and you are willing to work in the private sector for a few years, you can pay down that debt in a pretty reasonable fashion. There are a lot of ifs there, so just think about that. Like you have to get into a pretty good law school. You have to, get the attention of professors, and there's a whole game of law school that you don't need to know about right now. But the general theme there is it is possible to, use a legal degree to make enough money to pay off debt. I think that's generally possible, but it does mean you have to, do pretty well so that you can be in that position to be able to pay off the debt.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it, oh, sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just gonna ask who wants to weigh in.
Yeah, I think like without a doubt, it's a huge economic investment. I think that's one of the things that like I considered very heavily, but I also, one of the reasons I went to law school was because I knew that you could significantly increase what your earnings can look like in your future. So like as frankly, just as someone who grew up low income, that was important to me. But also considering the factors that Nima mentioned, like it depends on so much, like the school you go to and like how well you do. I mean, there are a lot of like if factors that you do have to weigh when you're thinking about law school and debt and all of those things. And that is another thing to take into account, like going to law school impacts what kind of jobs you can take, right? If paying off debt relatively quickly is important to you, or if like you just don't want to have a lot of debt for a certain amount of time, like you do have to think about what jobs you can take after you graduate. And like if big law and the environment and the day-to-day like work life balance is not something that you're interested in, you should also think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is it feels probably crazy to have to think about this when you're still in school or you're thinking about just even applying to law school. That probably feels like a big enough decision, but it is worth thinking about. What do you think you want to do with that law degree, right? And there's lots of different paths that people take out of law school. The private sector and sort of big law where Nima and I are, that's one path, right? There's government jobs, there's public sector type things that you can do. Nima mentioned something that he did, a clerkship. A lot of people do clerkships right after they finish law school. I mean, so there's lots of different things you can do, and sort of thinking about what you think you might want to do. I think can sort of help inform that question that Hannah raised a little bit about the value. I mean, really, honestly, right? Like there are people that work on my team at Mintz that are lawyers. They went to law school, got their JD, and sort of midway through were like, I don't think I want to practice. Like, I don't think I want to practice law. I've never asked those people flat out, like, hey, do you think it was worth it? Like, are you happy that you went and have the JD? And I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that question would be for them. But there's, that is something to think about what you think you might want to use the degree for, because I think to Nima and Adonis's point, like law school is expensive. And I think that is why a lot of people are attracted to jobs in the private sector right after. If you're interested in what sort of salaries look like in big law, it's actually very public information. You can like get that, you can Google it, and there's like public scales of how much big law pays their associates. And it's a lot of money, but to Hannah's point and Nima and Adonis's point, like it's a lot of money because you're working really hard and really long hours. And they're hard jobs to get. So like, that's not to scare or dissuade anybody, or like, but I think you should think a little bit about like, what is my end game? Like, what is it that I think I want to do to sort of help inform that decision about like, is this going to be worth it? Is this going to be like, what does the value of my degree really look like?
I think we can transition to the next question, which is, I guess this will be for Adonis and Nima, really. Which law schools did you apply to? And then how did you choose on the school that you settled on? Adonis having recently started, and then Nima making a switch after year one.
Yeah, I can start. So I don't really remember the number of schools I applied to. Maybe it was 14. Maybe it was 10. I don't know. I don't remember. But I applied to a range of schools, mostly in areas I would have wanted to work in. So a lot of the schools, and that's something to think about as well when you're thinking about applying to schools. So most of the schools I applied to were either in Boston, a few in like the New York tri-state area, then in DC. I honestly was in between Howard and BC when I was like making the final call on which school to go to. And that is because I'm a very community oriented person. That's also why I went to Holy Cross, right? Because of like the emphasis and value placed on community. And so that's kind of why those two were in my final two. Both of those schools also do well when it comes to placing in big law. So that's also a consideration that I had when deciding on the school that I wanted to attend. And when it came down to it, I'm from, like, I was raised here in Boston. So it was really a financial call. If I, like, in going to BC, I could stay at home, right, which saves me a lot of money. I also thought from a social perspective, I knew that I didn't want all of my friends that I knew in a certain place to be from law school. Like, I kind of wanted to be able to compartmentalize my law school life and my personal life. And I kind of thought, had I ended up in DC, a lot of my sort of social life outside my personal life outside of law school would be still encompassed by like my law school peers, and so therefore like lawyer talk and law school talk and all of those other things. Although I do think I would have made, you know, connections outside of law school. That was also something I thought about. Yeah.
I think I similarly applied to about 10 schools. I don't remember the exact number, but in terms of you know, strategy generally, it's not that different from undergrad in the sense that you have a reach, you have a target, and you have safeties, right? So you want to think in those terms. You want to look at what are the schools, and frankly, one way to do this is you're going to take the LSAT. It's not going to be enjoyable, but you'll take it, and you know, you'll study for it, you'll work hard and do what you can, but you'll get a score, and that score is going to have a significant impact on you know, where you're going to be able to land. It's not going to be dispositive. Like, for those who are worried, I did not do particularly well in the LSAT, and you managed to get into a good school. So it is not dispositive. But the reason I mention it in this context is because you can go online and you can check how these schools, what their medians are. So once you have a sense of what your basically your stats are, what your GPA is, what your LSAT score is, and then what your soft factors are, which is everything else, and those things can actually matter a lot. You then want to get a sense of your like list. So yes, it's 10 schools is what I applied to. I think that's a good number. I don't really think there's too many you can apply to. And another thing to keep in mind is obviously there's an application fee. So that's a bit of a consideration. But I do think a lot of schools actually have a waiver. So if that's an issue, you can actually get the application fee waived. And then you can apply to a ton of schools. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also just another addendum on the LSAT. I don't know if that's changing in terms of the influence in admissions. I know it's like a topic of discussion more broadly. I think it's still probably really influential in admissions decisions for schools that consider it. But I do know some have shifted to like other tests and whatnot. So I reserve judgment on any like developments in this space, but as a lawyer, obviously will do. But that's just something I wanted to flag as well. Oh, in terms of the switch, yeah. So I went to BC for the first year. I loved BC. So no, this is like no dog on BC. I loved my year there. But that's another thing to keep in mind, because some of you who are doing the research on this stuff, you might see that, you know, certain schools just have a higher rate of getting you clerkships with judges or getting you into certain law firms. And that was a bit of my rationale as well. Chicago Law has a pretty good reputation for getting people placed into academia. I don't know that I want to go in that direction, but I wanted to preserve that option, or, you know, increase the possibility that that would be an option someday, you know, not necessarily in the short term. So that was a bit of the calculus. But the point there is that the school that you get into, you can transfer after a year. And again, you don't need to think about the transfer process now, but just keep in mind that it's not like you get into a school and, you know, if it's not within a certain category, doesn't have a certain reputation within the region that you want, you can, you know, transfer. But regions mean a lot too. So like if you want to get into like a big law firm in Boston, BC and BU are like tremendous schools to go to, and they punch they punch well above their weight in this market. So I do think that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you for that insight. It's really helpful. I'm going to lump the next two questions together. Can you talk about the current job market for entry-level attorneys, and then perhaps some of the alternatives for folks with law degrees who don't want to practice law by the time that they finish grad school? I know Lauren mentioned that briefly, but some of the people on her team are people with law degrees.
I can start on that one, obviously, as somebody that recruits law students. So, I mean, I think overall, the number of students that go to law school every year, actually, like that's something that we look at, right? So it's like the number of students that are actually in law school, and then the number of students that want to maybe get into the private sector, and then how many big law firms there are. And so like it is, honestly, if you are in law school and you want to get into big law, there's a good opportunity there. Most big law firms hire mainly through what's called their summer associate programs. And that if you are interested in a career in big law, getting a position as a summer associate is sort of like a must do. And that is usually the summer between your 2L and your 3L year. But the recruiting for those programs typically happens in the spring and into the summer following your 1L year. So like Adonis right now is a 1L at BC, which I'm sure I can feel the stress starting to like percolate in his body. So sorry, but right, the kind of point he's at in his law school career right now, firms like Ropes and Mintz, we are like all over Adonis right now, right? It's like there's networking events. We were like teasing earlier before all of you guys jumped on, like we're hosting a recruiting event in our office in a couple of weeks. And I was like, Adonis, I hope we'll see you at Mintz, right? So like it's the recruiting actually happens like now and into the summer for your 2L year. I mean, so I think like job prospects, again, in like big law specifically are good. It's competitive. That's the most important part. When I'm talking to students that are getting ready to go to law school, when they ask me like, what's the single most important thing I can do? The single most important thing you can do your first semester of law school is put your head down and get good grades. Like that's the single most important thing that you can do. Because the process just happens really fast and sneaks up on you. And we as law firms like sometimes only have like a semester of your grades to go on. So like really focusing on your grades that first semester. Again, if you're interested in big law specifically and private sector specifically is definitely important. I mean, the legal industry is definitely not immune to downturns in the economy. Again, just being honest, like right now, there's definitely a softening in the economy. And I think law firms are thinking about that. Talking a little bit about like, would we want to think about reducing the size of our summer class a little bit? But like most firms are not going to like halt their law student recruiting because of the economy. That's pretty uncommon for big law firms. Like, again, there may be a bit of a softening there. There may be a little bit of like, maybe we reduce the size of our class a bit. But most firms are going to continue recruiting law students because they want to have a junior pipeline of talent. I can't really talk as much to like other paths like Nima, obviously it's like you did a clerkship after. I don't know if like that's if you want to talk about that a little bit and sort of like that process or prospects.
Yeah, sure. So we've mentioned clerkship a couple of times. So let me just take a step back and explain what that is. Basically, a clerkship is a 1-year apprenticeship in the legal profession. And some are 2 years, most are 1 year. And they, like many things we mentioned, can be very competitive. But the basic idea is that while you're a law student, people will apply for clerkships with judges, state judges or federal judges. And that's usually the year right after you graduate from law school, although increasingly it's actually not that. It's people are lawyers and are lawyers for years, and then they might apply for clerkships. But it's considered a great experience because you get to work with a judge and you get to help write opinions. So it's not clerk. When I like tell my mom, like, oh, like I told my mom, like, oh, I'm gonna go clerk for a year. She thought I was just like, going to go be a secretary for a judge for a year. And it's just like, what are you doing with like a law degree? And now you're just going to kind of like do clerical work. But what a clerk is actually doing is extensive legal research to help a judge, make decisions that will impact the law itself. So it's actually a tremendous experience. And for those of you who do go to law school, I highly suggest you look into it. In terms of the aspect of the question, and I'll also say, in terms of career prospects, I think it can be extremely helpful to have a clerk because you're going to develop amazing writing and researching skills, which are indispensable to firms. In terms of the other paths, that's a tough question. I was told a while ago, actually by a Holy Cross professor, that law school is like a trade school. And I really believe that, which, some of you may be thinking about law school and you don't know that you want to be a lawyer. Honestly, my suggestion would be to maybe put the decision off for some time and work in like for a few years. Don't just rush it because it is a massive commitment and that cannot be, stated enough. If you do not want to practice law, I'm not sure you should apply to law school, to be totally honest. It is too expensive. It's too competitive. And like you have to pass the bar exam at the end of it, which gets you a license to practice law. So if you don't want to practice law, then I guess you're not taking the bar exam. So like that's not to say that you should never do it, but I would say if that's something you're thinking about, my suggestion would be to go work for a few years and maybe as a paralegal so you can get to know what lawyers do, maybe in government, because a lot of lawyers, work in public policy and that's a thing as well. But I would just say, think very hard about that decision because like we've talked about, the economics of law school are such that if you're taking on a lot of debt, it can sometimes be the case that the jobs that will help you pay off that debt involve practicing law. So that's just something to keep in mind.
And I would just piggyback on that too, Nima, and say like from an employer's perspective, from a recruiting perspective, we really value candidates who have work experience. So like both Nima and Adonis took time off in between Holy Cross and applying to law school. And just candidly, like I think our hiring teams, our lawyers who are involved with hiring, just sort of believe that candidates with some work experience, like there's a maturity factor there a little bit. There's people who just sort of like, there's the conversation our lawyers will have. It's like, I know this person sort of knows what it means to work in some capacity. They understand that. And like that, just like real world work experience, no matter what you're doing, like is really beneficial and contributes so much to organizations. And so I actually think, our lawyers really value seeing that experience on candidates' resume and sort of knowing you've got some work experience under your belt. I mean, and so like anything, like the things obviously that Adonis and Nima mentioned about their backgrounds are super helpful. We see a lot of students who did programs like Teach for America in between, and like that experience like that is really valued. So I think I would totally echo what Nima said. I think if you're on the fence, I would not apply. I would wait, work, and then figure out if that's going to be the right thing for you. And if anything, having that time in between, I think is additive to you when you enter the job market.
Adonis, would you like to add to that, or would you like us to move on to the next question?
I think we can move on. I think they did a good job covering that question.
All right, I think we're going to have one last question for the group from us, and then we'll open it to students, if that works for the three of you. All right, so the last question from us, we've talked quite a bit about big law and how that can be one of the ways to help pay off the law school loans. But what recommendations do you have for people who want to work in what are often lower compensated roles, perhaps like public defenders or other types of jobs like that, which have really wonderful moral and ethical outcomes, but aren't necessarily the highest paid?
I think that's one of the things that you have to factor in when you're considering to go to law school and take on the economic burden of going to law school, and like what your job prospects will look like as well. I will also say, I know at BC, they have, like, as Nima was talking about earlier, scholarships. There are scholarships for students who are going into law school to take a public sector job, which offer, you know, scholarships ranging from, I'm not sure what amount, but I know that there are full scholarships for students who are interested in public interest work. And I know that was the same even at Howard and a lot of other schools. So I think there are probably more opportunities for people to get scholarships who are interested in public interest work because of the sort of what their income will look like when they graduate. But I think that's something to really consider when you're thinking about doing public interest work.
Yeah, I would just say, because we have emphasized big law a lot, and I don't want folks to think that the only way to go to law school is to become a corporate litigator or a corporate attorney. There are a lot of amazing things you can do with a law degree. That's, you know, why a lot of people want to become lawyers, because you can help a lot of people in need. And I think public defenders are doing tremendous work. So I really hope nothing said, you know, tonight discourages you from that path if you're interested in it. But rather encourages you to also just think realistically about the economic factors. I think with respect to, you know, that, there's also public service loan forgiveness. So research that a little bit. And the way that works is, you know, typically you work in government for about 10 years. So if you're like super committed and you know you want to have a career in government, maybe you look into that and you participate in the public service loan forgiveness program. What that, I think it generally entails you like have to work in government for 10 years, but make sure you look up online, because I think the rules are just changing and in a good way to actually make it easier. But there are paths to take if you're that committed and you think it's going to be your entire career. And it would be, you know, a mistake to not pursue that path if it's something you feel really strong about, and if it's like the reason you want to go to law school.
Nothing to add on that, Hannah.
All right. I think that it would be, we can open the floor to student questions. I know that Ben has received one student question. I don't know if you'd like to read that, Ben, or if the student himself would like to ask it.
Yeah, I think I can read the question that was sent in by the student. So the question was, hold on, let me get to it. If a student wants to wait to go to law school, take a couple of years off to work, I think Nima and Lauren had mentioned this. What would you recommend them doing, you know, apart from the obvious, maybe? So maybe we can throw it to Lauren from a recruiting resume building perspective. What do you think?
I feel like maybe this is gonna be like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but like I'm not sure it matters. I think you should do what you think you might be passionate about or you might enjoy. The thing that makes people stand out in a recruiting process is people who have genuine stories to tell about themselves. You're going to interview better for whatever job you're looking for out of law school, whether it's public sector, private sector, if your story is real and your story is genuine. So I don't know if I would like spend time worrying about doing like the right thing, and rather do something that like you're actually really interested in. And then if that still leads you to law school, then that's awesome. But if there's anything that I have also learned after graduating from college and in the decade that I've been out of Holy Cross, it's that like your life and your career is going to take just like twists and turns you can't totally anticipate. If you had told me as a senior at Holy Cross that I was going to be like recruiting, like a recruiter at like a big corporate law firm, I would have been like, what? Like, I don't even think I like even would have known what that is. So, you know, it's kind of a little bit of a cop out or maybe corny answer, but like, I'm not sure there's right boxes to check. I think it's more important that you do things that you feel passionate about after you graduate, because it's just going to make your story eventually when you're interviewing for jobs, whatever those look like, just more genuine.
Nima, Adonis, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would agree with just doing something that you feel passionately about. And like, honestly, after having interviewed for a lot of 1L jobs, exactly as Lauren said, like it makes your story just come together a lot nicer, and the conversation just feels more organic when you're talking about something that you care about. Like, I think there's so much, I don't know, I was speaking to a partner at a law firm, and I worked at Oracle, and it was much more corporate than teaching was. And the partner stressed that there was so much importance to that. I left it off of my resume just because I didn't feel like it kind of fit in with my story, but he said to add it anyways. And although like I didn't speak at length about it in interviews, I think having corporate experience is valuable. But I also think what really carried interviews was my teaching experience and how passionate I was about that. And that was also what they asked questions about, because they could tell that I was passionate about my teaching experience and enjoyed my teaching experience. I also think you can gain so many skills and just a variety of jobs. So I don't think there's necessarily, I don't like, from speaking to law school admissions officers, like it doesn't seem like there is one job or one like industry that makes someone more equipped to like go to law school or be a lawyer. Some of my peers at BC were bartenders like before they came to law school, right? And I think that is valuable when they're applying for jobs as well as anything else would be.
Yeah, I would agree in terms of, I don't think it really matters in terms of your job prospects for after law school or your admissions into law schools. The one point I might add is that to the extent what you're passionate about is a range of options, and there are certain jobs within that range that would actually allow you to work pretty closely with lawyers, I would go for those. And the reason is because the best way to learn what lawyers actually do is to know lawyers and to talk to them. That's basically just it. We all have really misinformed views of what lawyers are doing, and lawyers do a lot of different work. There's so many different types of lawyers who do different work. So I would just say, to the extent that you're able to do a job where you'll actually get to work with lawyers, and not necessarily in like a close capacity, but if you know that there'd be lawyers at your organization, then that's a person you can reach out to and say, what do you do? I'm thinking about law school and would like to just develop a relationship. That person might become a mentor to you. So that's just something I would, also think about.
There's a guy on my team at Mintz who just graduated from BC like literally a minute ago in 2022. And he works on the recruiting department with me. He's a recruiting coordinator, which is our like entry level recruiting position. And like he took the job because he wants to go to law school. Like, and he just exactly what Nima said. He wanted exposure to lawyers and law firms. And he's taking the LSAT this summer. So I think that's Nima. I think that's an awesome point. Like a really good it'll just give you some exposure.
We got another student question here as well. So what is the best way for students to learn either in college or after they're graduating when they're working? What types of law they might be interested in, kind of beyond, getting a job at an immigration law firm or something like that? Is there anything else that they could be or should be doing? Nima, why don't we start with you? You went last time, so start off with you.
I mean, my instinct is honestly no, because there are many different types of law, but you're going to get exposed to all of them, or not all of them, but a lot of them in law school. Like your first year of law school, there's a pretty universal curriculum, and it encompasses courses that have to do with property, torts, which is basically when people injure each other, and how the judicial system tries to respond to those problems, criminal law, constitutional law. So I would keep an open mind. But I don't know. Adonis might have better views here just because he's a bit closer to that. Like the Holy Cross experience. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't think it really matters that much, personally.
Can you repeat the question?
So, what's the best way for students to learn more about and discover the types of law they may be interested in?
That's that's a really good question. I honestly, I think for me, I don't even know what type of law I want to go into. So like,
Say, Adonis, do you even know what kind of law you want to practice?
like that's such a big question. I think, yeah, I'm not going to. I mean, from speaking to attorneys, like I think it's pretty normal that you may not necessarily know what, for example, in like the private sector, what practice area. I don't know if you all know what that even means, but like I'm gonna actually just take a step back from this question.
Yeah, really the only other insight I could provide is from talking to a lot of law students over the course of the last couple of years is I think that really maybe there are people who I think are sort of know that they want to be a litigator. I think that it can be so like, I think there are people who are sort of, I like tease that, people who are sort of like come out of the womb arguing, right? Like someone who just sort of like knows and I'm sure you can think of, I've got like a slew of litigators at Vince who I can think of where I'm like, God, you just must have been like born arguing. Like, and like, I tease them about it, but like, I think there are some people who like really sort of know in their heart of hearts and their gut that like, they want to be like Nemo said, like they want to be like a courtroom litigator, right? And that is sort of like, they like know that. I think really other than that, like unless you are sort of like born with that instinct, I think like Nima and Adonis are sort of spot on, right? Like you're just gonna talk to people, you're gonna take classes, certain things are gonna like call to you either way or the other. I'm not sure there's like, again, like a right way or a recipe to like figure out what you wanna do.
We have one final question at this point, I think it's about that time, right, Ben? Where you know what? There are two. I'll leave it up to you. The one out of the two that you'd like to answer. There are two at the bottom of our options here. Students are curious about top 14, top 12, top 14 schools and the value of those versus going to a school that might offer perhaps a better financial package. And then there's a new option, a relatively new option, the Masters of Law, for people who might want a legal background but don't necessarily want to practice law. If you could speak to one or either of those, I apologize for shoving two questions together again. It's me trying to maximize class time or meeting time.
I'm not really too familiar with the Masters of Law thing, but I will speak to, like, before coming to law school, I was deciding between getting a master's in public administration or a JD, which is a law degree. And what kind of made me decide on getting a JD? One of my mentors just told me there are a lot of things that, like, everything you can do with an MPA, you can do with a JD, and you can do more like than that with a JD. So I don't know what a master's of law entails. But I think I would urge that person to think about what their job options look like from that degree.
I think the Masters of Law, if I'm right, is an LLM. It's like so that's interesting, and it's very just to take a step back on that, the JD is the American law degree. So that's the degree that will allow you to apply for admission to the bar of any state in the country. The LLM is like an international certificate of sorts. It has more global recognition, but there aren't a lot of jobs as so for example, if you wanted to practice law abroad, you would probably need an LLM. So it's not necessarily just sort of like a master's, then you're learning a little bit about law. It's to get into a community of attorneys who may be involved in more transnational work. So I would just do a bit of digging on there. They're very different degrees, lead to very different careers. Sometimes people have a JD and an LLM because you want to be practicing as an attorney in the United States, and you may want to, like, for example, there's like an LLM in tax. And so a lot of people have a JD, and then they also become specialized tax attorneys. In terms of the T14 question, I mean, it matters, unfortunately. I mean, I wish I could say it didn't matter. I do think it matters. They are the top schools, and employers and others, especially judges for clerkships, I think still highly value trying to get into the T14 schools. That being said, and this is a big caveat, getting into one of those schools by no means assures that you're going to get a lot of the options. You could get into a T14 school, but if you didn't perform, like in the top half of your class, you're not going to get the opportunities that schools many ranks below the T14 are going to get if they performed well. So it's again, like a factor that can help you. And some schools in the T14 may be more likely to lead to certain opportunities. So I mentioned like academia, for example. It could be that over time, these, I hope over time it becomes easier to penetrate some of these fields, with degrees that aren't necessarily part of those rankings. But I think it just helps, you try to get into the best school you can. In terms of the economics of it, again, if you're going for big law, you go to T14 school, you're going to pay a lot of money. So there's that. But you can probably trade on it because it'll increase your likelihood of getting a big law job. But again, if you're not planning on big law, then that may not be as feasible. So there are people who get into T14 schools, but they get that public service public service scholarship, which is like a full ride, and they want to be like, a public defender, or maybe want to work in public service in some other way. And then they pursue a career, or they go to a different law school. And that's probably a better decision in certain cases. So that's all that is to say that, like, yes, it's a factor and it matters for certain careers, but it's only a factor, and it's by no means, the only one that matters in this field.
I think the only thing I'd add is something Adonis said earlier, that, if a T14 is, if you don't get into a T14 for whatever the situation is, I do think a strategic thing to think about is geographic market then, of sort of where you think you want to be after you graduate, right? So like, again, like using Mintz as an example, if you're thinking about big law, we're a big Boston law firm. And so we do a ton of recruiting out of Boston College and Boston University law schools, even though they are not T14 law schools. And we're much more likely to recruit out of BC and BU because they're schools sort of in our backyard that are good law schools that produce great lawyers than we are at like American down in DC, which is also not a T14 law school, but it's not in our backyard, right? So like thinking about sort of like where you want to be after you finish law school in terms of geography, I think is an important consideration if a T14 law school is just like doesn't work out in terms of the admissions process.
Well, I think we are a little over time, so we could obviously talk about this all night. So first of all, folks, join me in thanking our alums. I'm going to do my clap emoji hand thingies there. So thank you all so much for lending your time, talent, and expertise to us tonight. Where can folks connect with you? Is LinkedIn the best place for folks to connect and touch base if we're able to do that?
LinkedIn, email's fine. I think you have my email, so I'm open to, you can share that.
Email is better for me, Ben, just because of my job. I get so many random LinkedIn messages. So email is better for me. And I also was just going to mention Mintz, and I'm sure Rope says too, but because I'm at Mintz, obviously we do have, I asked today about some entry level openings that we either currently have posted or like are planning to post in the next month or two, just sort of knowing that graduation is coming up. So if any of you are seniors and are graduating and didn't apply to law school, or are making, whatever. I do, Ben, I could send you like a list of those jobs and maybe we could get them posted on Handshake or something.
Absolutely, Lauren. Let's chat. That sounds great.
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn not the best for me. I do not check it that often. So I would just shoot me an email. Ben has my email. My Gmail's fine. My email's also like I think on a website somewhere, so you can feel free to shoot my firm email as well. Not both because that might come off a little too strong, but certainly one is perfectly
Hot tip,
fine.
hot tip, hot tip.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to these fantastic alumni, and thanks to everybody for being here tonight. Dr. Abrahamson, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, just thank you so much.
All right. Have a great evening, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing, guys. It was fun.
Yeah, it was.